Hey, how's everyone doing? Greg Harrington with Gramercy Cellars here, and this is our third live stream during this detention at home. I think there's like two stories in the wine business right now, and one of them is the restaurant business is really having a tough time, and we totally agree with that. We feel really bad for everyone in the restaurant business. And the other story that I keep reading is basically these virtual tastings suck. So what I would like to do is basically let's make this not be boring and have it interactive and not just about us standing around drinking wine and hanging out. So let's try to give some maybe meaningful information. Maybe that'll happen once in my life. And if anyone has any questions out there, if you put them in the comments, we can see them. Sometimes they go by really fast, but we'll try to answer them. So with us today, obviously, we have my partner in Gramercy Cellars, Brandon Moss, back. Hopefully, we can hear him and he's not blasting out of the volume and feeding back like we had the problem we had last week. And Brandon, why don't you say hi just so we can check the audio?
Hi, guys.
Sounds good to me.
Perfect.
And second of all, we have Christopher Bates. So this is an honor for me because I've known Christopher. When did we meet? 2006, 2005? Or did we meet before that?
Yeah, it must have been somewhere around then.
Yeah, and it's funny, Christopher. I was actually going through your story, and I was like, "Wow, I feel like you're stalking me." When we actually look at our histories are very, very close because obviously we both went to Cornell. We went to the hospitality school, the hotel school there. Then we both went into the restaurant business, and then we both started wineries, and we both passed the master sommelier exam. And we basically both did it in New York and Washington State. So I think that's a really great thing. But Christopher how many businesses do you own now?
4 to 7 to 8, something like that. Depends on COVID times and non-COVID times.
I know it's like every day you're starting a new thing. But one of the things I really respect that Christopher did is he came and worked harvest with us, and then went back to New York State up in the Finger Lakes where Cornell is, and started his own winery, which is called. Well, actually, Chris, why don't you tell us about your winery real quick?
Yeah, it's Element Winery. So we started it actually. I mean, I was out basically doing harvest with you as we were gearing up for our first vintage, really. So it is a tiny little winery based here in the Finger Lakes, kind of focused on trying to sort of really discover what the true long-term quality potential is here, and ultimately trying to help kind of continue to develop and drive our wineries and what is thought of as the potential of the Finger Lakes in the long term. So tiny little place. We make about 1,000 cases, and yeah, that's kind of it.
Cool. And then why don't you talk about your two restaurants too? I haven't had the good fortune to visit FLX yet, but I've been to the winery a couple times, which is awesome. So
cool, yeah. So we actually we have a bunch of places, but FLX Winery was our first restaurant. We opened it back in 2014. Actually, we opened it a year to the date. It turns out, from the day I passed the master's exam, and it is basically just a super simple little roadside hot dog and hamburger stand. Great beverages, great beer, great wine, and really simple but good food. Nice fries and that kind of stuff. And then we opened FLX Table, which is a tasting menu-driven place, tiny little spot based on communal dining, which is not apparently in favor right now. So one little place with 14 seats basically at one big long table where everybody's sort of meant to meet and greet and talk and have a dinner party essentially together. So that spot is we do 5 courses and lots of cool wine pairings, mostly. And then we opened FLX Frybird, which is our fried chicken place. So fried chicken, pretty much fried chicken, sherry and champagne. And then we've got, sadly, 4 places in development right now. So we're going to do a couple of new restaurant concepts, and then another winery and another Provisions, which is our little wine shop.
awesome. That's you're a busy man. So I don't know how you do all that. But one thing I know Christopher does really well is educate and teach, because I've unfortunately had to follow him sometimes, and every time I have to follow, I'm like, oh man, I got to up my game because he's really good. So hopefully today we will impart some of that knowledge to everyone that's watching. So what we said we're going to do is we sent out a bunch of an offering on 2014 vintage, and we're going to taste some of those wines. We're not going to taste all of them because I want to be able to walk tonight. And Brandon has little children at home that probably shouldn't see dad drunk. Or do the kids see you drunk? Like, oh yeah, you're spitting. Okay, that's a little better. So Brandon, so since I can't even basically remember Monday, I think today's Thursday. Let alone back to the 2014 vintage. What was the 2014 vintage like? Do you still have a recollection of what it's like? Recollection.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it as being in our string of hot vintages in Walla Walla. So we had a couple of really cold vintages in 2010 and 2011. And I remember us thinking like, wow, these wines are retaining tons of acidity. Like these vintages, like we're not sure if we're going to be able to get our grapes ripe, and then hit 13, 14, and 15. So each year being subsequently warmer, warmer, and warmer. So 14 was warm throughout. We had very few heat spikes, but we had consistency throughout the whole vintage. So, you'll see a lot of kind of riper style wines from the 14 vintage, but keeping to our style, I think our 14s are still very fresh. We still picked our Syrah early, but it was a really warm year.
Yeah. So when winemakers are talking, we talk about cold years and warm years. For everyone out there that's listening that's never actually worked harvest, or doesn't really geek out and understand the difference between what a warm year is and what a cold year is. In the what parts of the vineyard cycle or the growing cycle are we talking about? Like, what does it affect?
I mean, the most important is by far, the month of August and September, really. I mean, that's what's going to determine a lot of your ripening. But then, throughout the season, there's kind of important times where temperatures need to be precise for us. That being flowering, bud break. There's a lot of times where, if you have rain and cold during flowering, you're going to have a bad set, and then you're going to have low crop yields and things like that. And so there's specific times of year, but by far the most important are August and September.
Yeah, Chris, what about for you in the Finger Lakes? Or do you have really hot vintages up there, or are you just battling cold most of the time?
Well, I think actually one of the funny things, not to get too geeky about the Finger Lakes here, but essentially, I always try to. I think it gets confusing when people talk about us as being a cool climate. We're not a cool climate. We're an extreme climate. So, like you guys, we have freezing cold winters, which is a huge problem for us, and occasionally we have some frost issues. So, our biggest issue here is definitively vines surviving our cold winters. We'll hit -5, -10 is pretty normal. -15 is a couple of times a decade. So we really struggle with that. But the reality is that when we talk about our growing season, it's kind of funny. Right before we hopped on, Brandon and I were just talking about your guys' spring so far, and I noticed that he talked about what happened when bud break was happening. We're still waiting for ours. So our season is super short. But it's kind of funny because like we don't get extremes like you guys do in Washington. So here in the Finger Lakes, it's 75 to 85 with nice amounts of moisture pretty much every single day of the growing season. So while we have a short growing season and we don't get hot per se, our usable degree days are unbelievably high here. In fact, I think they're almost on par with Washington, and I think we actually have more growing degree days than Napa because we don't have hydric stress, we don't have temperature stress, so our vines never really shut down. I mean, basically from May 15th to September 25th, every single day is a ripening day from 8 a.m. till 9 p.m. for us. So, yeah. But with us, it's not necessarily that we're battling cold; it's that we're battling how long the growing season is, and ultimately, just trying to balance everything to maximize that ripening time that we have.
Yeah, yeah. I had a feeling from the conversations that you and I have had that the growing seasons were similar, especially when you taste the Syrah that you make and you taste what we make. It tends to be along. Obviously the regions are different, but you're still on that same kind of um, page that like you could easily blind taste these wines as being interchangeable with each other. It's one of the reasons that we wanted to talk to you. So why don't we start? Why don't we just drink some Peak Pool and talk about Peak Pool? Since did we send you Peak Pool, Chris?
Send me people.
Peak Pool. I'll send you a lot of people, but I'm
Yeah.
wondering if we sent you this. Cool.
Yeah. So why are you making peak pool?
Because we were blackmailed for no other reason. No, what happened was, and a lot of people who are in our wine club know the story, but one of the best things we love to do in Washington is kind of go to our growers and say, hey, when your grandparents, great parents got this property, they got 10,000 acres, and you're only using 400. Hey, can we go over here and plant Syrah with this clone and this spacing? And we went to the Olson family, who are major farmers in kind of the middle of Washington, right near Red Mountain. And we said to them, hey, we really want Grenache on head trained vines, or head trained. That's the classic thing that you would find when you go to Châteauneuf-du-Pape or Gigondas or Vaccarat in the Southern Rhone. So no one I didn't think that anyone had ever done it in Washington. I'm hearing now that maybe McRae had a little bit planted, but Grenache had some problems in the 90s where a lot of it got wiped out. So we might not be the first, but we were very, very interested in having head-trained vines. Why do we want head-trained vines? Because it protects us from the sun. You have a different balance in the vineyard, and we thought it would be really cool. So Leif had planted all kind of crazy varieties in Washington, and he said, yeah, I'd love to plant that for you. But he said, look, I have this grip called Peak Pool. It's been in the ground for 7 years. No one's ever made it. We throw it in our Chardonnay every year. So you have to make it for a year, and then we will take out the Peak Pool and plant the Grenache for you. So we made the Peak Pool. Brandon, from his New Zealand days and Oregon days, had some mad white winemaking skills, and I'm looking at him like, I don't know, you're on your own on that one. I have no idea what you're doing with the white. So Brandon basically made the wine, and Leif called us in like February, and he's like, okay, what do you think of the people? Do you want me to rip it out? Do you want me to plant the Grenache? And it didn't really taste like anything. We were like, it just tastes like dry white wine. That's pretty zippy and pretty fresh. So I told him to rip it out. And in April and May, really started to regret that decision, and went, well, that was a bad decision, because the people really turned around and was amazing. And then another winemaker in town just kept coming to the tasting room and buying it, and basically heard that we had ripped it out and said, I'm going to find you a Peak Pool vineyard. And luckily, a vineyard almost next door to Lake Helene Vineyard had a little bit of Peak Pool. So we became the Peak Pool Kings of Washington. So I've been trying to become the Peak Pool King of the world, but there's like one winery in the Languedoc every year. Like, we get a 92, they get a 92 plus. We get a 91 plus, they get a 92. So it's like my goal in life right now is to beat out this winery in the Languedoc. And make a better Peak Pool and be the Peak Pool King of the world. So maybe someday. So
high goals you have there. High goals.
Exactly. I'm a simple man, so I just sit in my house and work. So
how are you making this?
If you were to describe Peak Pool to, you have it on your wine list, and how would you describe it to someone? A customer says, I don't know what that is. What does it taste like?
Lean, dry, fruit forward, mineral. I mean, It's acid is the first thing you notice on this wine when you put it on your palate, you know. But it's very fresh, you know. That's what I love about this wine. It keeps that fresh fruit aromatics, and very floral as well. That's another thing I love about this wine.
Yeah, Chris, what do you think about it? What does it remind you of? The worst wine I've ever had in my life.
Peak Pool is always is one of those grapes that, like, for me is pretty bland. Let's say it tends to be fairly neutral for me more often than not, and like especially when we see Lee's usage used on it and that kind of stuff. But it's a grape that even in the Languedoc manages to give acidity somehow. So in another climate, it's amazing how crispy this gets. So, for me, it reminds me a little of that, like, kind of mineral driven lemon apple thing that I get from Muscadet that I love so much, with that just kind of zippy, salty crispness to it. So really beautiful, fresh little wine.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because a lot of the other wines we make are always running around trying to balance what's the acid, what's the tannin, and the acid is dropping, the flavor's not there, or the seeds aren't where we want, so on and so on. And with Peak Pool, you just wait for the acid to drop. There's literally nothing else to do. It'll be October 5th and the acid is still 10. And in winemaking terms, that's lemon juice. That's like really, really unripe German Riesling. So we just kind of pick it whenever. So there's a little comment from Jay Stephenson 1 here. We know that winery in the Languedoc, so you can inform that winery that we're coming for them. So we will make better people than they make at some point. So
no more number 2. We're going to be number 1.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think Chris, if you're going to explain how to pair food and wine for wines like this, what are you looking for? Because I get this question all the time. People are like, what do I eat with it? How do I pair food and wine? We don't need to go into a entire MS food and wine 45-minute lecture, but what are some of the things you're thinking about when you're looking at something like this?
You don't have the sumo wrestler slide ready for me?
Yeah, exactly.
So for me, though, really honestly, kicking off of that, I mean, ultimately for me, it's always about weight and balance, right? And it's how intense is the wine and how intense is the thing that I'm putting it with. And then coming at it from, my real background is in the kitchen. So coming at it from a culinary background, ultimately, I really like to just look at, like, what is this wine if it were an ingredient? And so for me, when I'm looking at a wine like this, it's always like, this is my acid, this is my lemon. So I always think about anything that traditionally a chef who isn't thinking about the wine pairing, what they would add lemon to, and that's kind of what I want this with. So whether it's oysters, though I'm always hesitant to make an oyster pairing. I remember reading, what was that food and wine pairing book years ago that you did a long, long page on oyster pairing with, I think. Was that the...
Oh, what to pair with what you eat, maybe?
Karen Page.
Yeah, what to pair with what you eat.
Yeah, it was like the geekiest description of oyster pairing I've ever seen, by the way, Greg. But, I think something like oysters or something where, like, you might squeeze a lemon on top. Personally, I just would eat the oyster and drink it with wine that has this much lemon kind of freshness to it. Pretty like whitefish dishes where there's something like buttery or creamy to it. This is just going to cut through that so gorgeously, and like just sort of in again, it's that finding that balance. It's that dish that you want just a little bit more acid to. Well, for me, the wine becomes that acid.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I explain it the exact same way. Basically, if you have a wine like this, if you can put lemon on the food, the pairing will usually work. Will it always work? No. And just as an FYI, a little bonus for tuning in, you want to learn how to pair another 500 varieties. If it's a variety that ends in a vowel and is from an old world country, so any place they had a king or a queen or a castle, I stole the castle part from you. Sorry. That pairing is going to work. So Falangina, Greco, Vermentino, Verdicchio, Eberluce, so on and so on and so on. And there's reasons why, but it's super easy to pair these wines that are super minerally and high acid. So, well, cool. Why don't we taste some? Let's taste some red wine. You want to taste Forgotten Hills Syrah? Yeah. So, Chris, we're going to ask you your death row meal later. Um, what is your what's your death row wine? And not a vintage and not a producer. Well, yeah, actually, maybe a producer, but you don't need to throw out a vintage.
Hmm. That's so hard, dude.
I know.
Like that's just such an impossible question.
All right,
I
so
mean,
you're really thirsty after this. What are you going to drink?
mezcal.
There you go.
Um, you know, uh, so I saw the death row meal option, and so I had thought my way through that because I could start with the food and work my way in a circle around both what I wanted to eat and drink. When it comes down to what to drink, it just changes for me so regularly. Like
Yeah,
my list of top five is pretty standard, but to pick one, that's like picking a kid, I think.
I know. It's funny because I definitely go through cycles, as Brandon knows, because all the wine that I order goes to the winery, not to Seattle, so I don't drink it. And I was on a Beaujolais kick for a while, and I have enough Beaujolais to feed a small village over at the winery. So when you visit the winery, you want some Beaujolais, I'm your man.
Yeah, aged Beaujolais.
Aged Beaujolais, yeah. All right, how about an easier question? Um, Favorite Syrah producer? Who do you think does it well? And not the big three. So no Jamais, no Allemande, and no Roasting. You didn't know we were gonna play.
Great,
We
because
were
I
gonna
just five
play
wants from
Wine
one of
Jeopardy,
them.
did you?
So,
What was that?
um, you know, I love the wine. Like, and it's again, like when we talk about wine, for me, it's always the fact that there's the way that the wine tastes, but there's also sort of your history and your connection and your remembrance of it, and like the joy that it brings you to drink, whether that's in the glass or not in the glass. But for me, Levay has always been one of my favorite producers. I absolutely love their wines.
You're just looking over
Graillot.
my shoulder, right? That was.
No, it's funny. I actually can't see you on the video.
Oh, that's right. Oh,
Uh,
okay. That's actually really funny because behind me in our picture is a bottle of Levay 2012 Lush Gavroche. So the strange things that sommeliers have in their living
that
rooms.
wine. I love that wine. But ultimately, like I mean, Graillot. I've been obsessed with Alain Graillot for 20 years now. I think it was probably about 20 years ago I bought my first case of Graillot, and it has been something that just like it's part of my life at this point. I love
Yeah.
that wine so much.
Yeah, that's a Longorayo Crozes Hermitage. For those of you who might not know the reference, great wines, not crazy expensive, has not risen while a lot of the other
Stop
price.
telling them.
Yeah, I know, but that's what I get paid for. All right, let's talk about Forgotten Hills. So, Brandon, since you've been really spearheading the management of this vineyard, and just kind of a quick history was this vineyard was planted by a gentleman named Jeff Hill in the mid 90s. And then it got sold to Waters Winery, and then Waters managed it, and we used fruit from it for a while. And then we started managing it 2010, 2011, and then purchased it in 2015. And our goal with the vineyard and all of our estate vineyards is to go organic in the vineyard, and that's where we are now. But poor Brandon has had to be the one that has been battling it because it's kind of like kids. You try to get kids off a sugar diet onto a fresh fruit and vegetable diet, they're going to revolt a little bit. And vineyards do the exact same way. So every day or every week when Brandon and I talk, it usually starts a lot with, "Oh, this stupid vineyard and blah blah blah. I can't believe what it did." So, much it, Brandon, talk a little about what's going on out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a tricky site in that most people think about Walla Walla as a pretty warm area, but being as where Forgotten Hills is situated in the valley, it gets a lot of cool air running through the vineyard, mostly mountain runoff. And just where Forgotten Hills is, it kind of sits in this sink where a lot of that cold mountain air just sort of sits inside the vineyard. So it translates to basically if we have moisture, it's going to take a little bit longer for that moisture to go away. Therefore, the tricky thing when farming organically is dealing with mildew. That's the main thing that we have to be careful about with organic. But it's all worth it. It's a little more care, a little more times out in the vineyard, trying to make sure that that we're battling it properly. But at the same time, I mean, it's amazing the difference that you see in the soil between 2013 when we first got the vineyard and now. The soil, you can see that it's alive now. You can see earthworms in it. You can see the effects of going organic. It has been a battle, and we've had years where you have to drop some of the fruit in the vineyard. But you know, it's kind of part of the battle that's well worth it. You know.
Yeah, I want to put up a map of Walla Walla for everyone to see. So this is kind of a map of Walla Walla, and if you look at the line that's right across the screen, that's the Oregon border. And if you look at where the Oregon border meets kind of the outline of Walla Walla, that would be Lake Helene Vineyard, and Forgotten Hills is basically a mile due west. So it is a vineyard that lies right at the base of the hills. And if we look at the hills, this is a picture of Lake Helene and the hills, and that site, that picture there would be about, Forgotten Hills would be a little farther away, but that's a relative distance to where we'd be looking at. So basically, all the cold air just rolls out of the Blue Mountains and right into Forgotten Hills. So, Brand, do you remember this year the pick time difference between Lake Helene and Forgotten Hills? How long was it this year? Remember?
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty much all of our picks are done at Lake Helene by generally September 10th at the latest. We don't even need to sample Forgotten Hills until at least middle September, and rarely do we harvest it before October 1.
Yeah, it's a pretty crazy site that way. So
yeah, and it's slow sugar accumulation. You know, it's nice because you get a lot of hang time. You retain a lot of the acidity, and you don't get that much sugar accumulation. So you can make wines that are really balanced and still bring in that earthiness and that black pepper, but you get development because of the hang time. So,
yeah, Chris, stems in Syrah. What's your thoughts, Christopher?
Always, all of them.
Are you doing 100% always?
Yeah. So, so after doing, it's funny. I didn't really think much about it. After doing harvest with you I think it must have been 9. I think after doing harvest with you, and I remember back then you were super concerned about stem usage, and especially like from the New York climate. I remember you even like suggesting trying to rack off the seeds during fermentation and things like this. And you made me really nervous. So when I came back, I had this mentality. I was like, oh, I'm going to do 100% stem inclusion when I was going out to see you. And then as I'm coming back, I was like, Jesus, I guess I shouldn't do stem inclusion. And so the first vintage of Syrah was 2010, and I think I did like 60%. And at the end of the day, I tasted the wine, and I was like, I should have used more stems. This is dumb. And I've used 100% ever since. And I didn't really think all that much of it until I think you and I were teaching a class together at Cornell, and you started to talk a little bit about your change in mentality for stem usage. And kind of for everybody that's listening, like to explain stem usage, essentially what we're talking about is most often, or in many grapes, you oftentimes will take the grapes off of the stem with a big machine that just knocks the grapes off of like all the little stemmy pieces that hold it together. But in some grapes, it's pretty typical to use those stems, and you use them for a couple of different reasons. And so like they'll add tannic structure, and that they'll add some spice characteristic. But one of the big things of like the last, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years is this huge push towards like, you can't use green stems. You'll hear people talk about it all the time, and they'll use the word lignification or brown stems, which basically is like them dehydrating and drying out. And everyone tells you you've got to use brown stems. You've got to use brown stems. If you have green stems, you'll ruin your wine. And here in the Finger Lakes, we don't get lignification. Like it just doesn't happen. Our stems are vibrantly green.
This whole thing. It's funny. There's these things in the wine business that just never go away. That to me comes from the Pinot Noir side, because as we've been starting to make Pinot Noir, particularly in the Willamette Valley, if you don't have stem lignification, you're gonna have some surprises, and you might have some stuff that you don't like at all. But even in the Rhone, they don't get stem lignification. So basically, stems turning from green to brown. That's why we say you got to taste it. And our marker is: does it taste like bitter broccoli, or does it taste like snow pea? And the more like snow pea it tastes, the more we use it. And I guess going back to me being a little wary about stems, it was probably the time when we started using a lot more rocks vineyards. And Brandon and I have a nickname for some. If you use too much stem in the rocks, Brandon, what's the nickname?
Swamp water.
Swamp water. It gets this decomposing vegetable kind of flavor that just never goes away. And,
weird.
Yeah. So it is not something that we want. And I say all the time, stems is basically like it's like making a steak. If you use too much salt, there's too much. If you don't use enough, it's missing. But even with a steak, if it's over salted, I'm still happy. And the stems kind of start to go away as time goes on. So yeah, I haven't tasted this wine in a long time. I like it a lot.
What was the stem usage here?
I think this was about 70% overall. Fermented in 3-ton Nomblo concrete fermenters. And then basically aged in neutral puncheons for the most part.
Yeah, and you know what, Chris, you know what I feel like too, and Brandon, I feel like as we were transitioning this vineyard to conventional / sustainable farming over to organic, I feel like we went through kind of a 2, maybe 3-year period where the stems really weren't cooperating as much as we want. Because I feel like Brandon and I had a conversation where I was like, okay, no more than 50% in all the Forgotten Hills. And he's like, no, you got to taste this because this is coming around and this is coming around. And it almost like it did this little dip. And now as the vineyard gets healthy and vibrant and more alive and happy, we can use more stems. And I think that's been a really cool thing. Why don't we taste this next to Lagniappe? Do you have Lagniappe, Brendan?
I got Lagniappe right here. I'm going to do a side-by-side here. A very different profile.
I guess I should have brought a stick. Oh.
So 14 Lagniappe, the makeup.
14 Lagniappe is mostly red willow, so I think it's 85% red willow. Then we rounded that out with a little bit of Forgotten Hills and just a splash of Minix Syrah out of Prosser.
Yeah. To me, it's a little more lifted, a little more red fruit.
It's definitely more fruit driven, whereas the Forgotten Hills is more kind of mineral and iron and blood.
I keep wanting to spit, and probably not the best idea to spit on camera, particularly when my head is like filling a third of the entire space. So
I'd say the Lagniappe Syrah is also much more. It has more tannin and structure. Probably will go longer in the cellar than the Forgotten Hills, but the Forgotten Hills is definitely like mineral driven.
Yeah, even if you're not tasting this, you could probably understand the statement that I'm going to make here. This is. Comparing these two wines is one of the things that convinces me that I'm never going to fully understand or even partially understand winemaking and viticulture, because you look at the differences in the temperature here. Red Willow is probably a little bit warmer site. Well, it's definitely a warmer site. It's a hillside site, and where Forgotten Hills is more of a flat site. And these wines are probably picked a month to 5 weeks apart. But for whatever reason, Red Willow, even in the hot climate, still retains so much freshness and so much acid. And normally you would think that if you pick so much earlier, you're going to have green flavors, you're going to have unripe flavors, you're going to have just a wine that's totally incomplete. But every single time, Red Willow is always the first thing we pick, almost to the point as I'm afraid to tell people, like, hey, yeah, we picked that on September 1st. And they're like, really? Like, why are you using that site? Because, the cool kids picked Syrah in October and early November. So it's one of those things that I just honestly have no idea why that is, but it is. So, any reason, Brandon? Brandon, figure it out right now on camera.
I mean, it's Red Willow is kind of an anomaly in Washington in terms of the soil is different. It's a much sandier soil. Kind of where the hillside is, where our block is, was actually interestingly enough on this basically what was an island during the Missoula floods. And so the hillside, the chapel block where we get our Syrah, actually retains some sandstone that you won't really find anywhere else in Washington. So that's kind of interesting. Sandy soils generally keep the wines fresh, and so maybe that has something to do with it. But no, you're right. I mean, despite being a hot site, our earliest pick, it has that real freshness to it.
Yeah. Chris, do you have any sites like that just drive you crazy? And you're like, I don't know, but it works.
Yeah, all of them. Honestly, the Finger Lakes is, and I think I think what you're talking about is a really important thing. And you brought it up earlier when we talk about like warm vintages and cold vintages or extreme vintages, and talking about like variations in styles. One of the things that I think we can learn in books everything we want about wine, but the reality is that when you start really getting to know wine, you realize how both personal everything is. So like you talk about like good vintages, bad vintages, or, I thought you were going to talk about it earlier when you said like winemakers see it as warm vintages and cold vintages. It's funny because as you said that, my first thought was, well, critics see it as warm vintage or as warm vintages are great vintages. Sommeliers see it as cold vintages are great vintages. Exactly. And winemakers kind of run this like back and forth in between the two. But I think the same thing can be said about like, as we learn more and more about like vineyard sites, it seems, and at least for me, is like every time I have this dogmatic idea, like this is how it has to be done. And then I'm tasting fruit from a vineyard that doesn't do it that way. And I'm like, why is this so freaking good? And then I taste fruit from a vineyard that does it exactly the way that I feel like it's supposed to be done. And it's like, I don't like this fruit at all. I like the other one better. And so you just sort of constantly, for me, I'm like going back and going, oh no, everything I learned is wrong. And that just doesn't work here. That's not what I like. That's not how I want it done. So it's almost always counterintuitive to me when you think about stuff like that. And like that so much of the book learning doesn't always apply to actual real life situations in winemaking.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like even, I say all the time with Syrah, the only reason I feel halfway competent with Syrah is because of the book Wines of the Northern Rhone. I'm seeing if I have it here somewhere. No, it's here somewhere. That book came out maybe a year after we started making wine, and I looked through all the producers that I love. All the producers you recommended it this before, and they basically said this is the way that they make wine, and we just started making wine that way. But otherwise, we would have been wandering in the dark for a lot longer. I think we eventually would have figured it out, but it would have taken a while, and yeah, it's definitely one of those things where book learning, university learning doesn't always match up at all. So here's a good question here. So the question is, what happens if you pick Red Willow later? And I'll answer that one. And for me, the biggest problem particularly with Syrah, is, at least to my palate, probably drink too much high acid Nebbiolo, but when Syrah gets to a certain ripeness level, it starts getting sweet, and not sweet in the sense of sugar like ice cream and dessert, but it has this sweet component to it, and it's just something I don't like. So, and that's just personal, because there's a lot of gray wines that are definitely more ripe. They're just not the style that I'm used to anymore. So for me, it's just when it starts getting sweet, that's when I want to back off and go lower and lower, and that's kind of where we're always driving for with Syrah.
Yeah, I agree. And also, it can tend to go cooked fruits and prune plum. And I feel like that at that point we've gone a little too far with Syrah as well when it goes cooked fruit and prune plum.
Yeah. So does Syrah in the Finger Lakes do that too?
No, not at all.
Never. Yeah.
We don't get cooked fruit here. We can. So it's funny, like you said, like when the cool kids all pick in November. I always pick, I don't know, 2 weeks before pretty much everybody else does, even in our climate. But our fruit rarely gets that far. I mean, if we're really pushing, like we'll hit 24 bricks, 25 bricks, if we really push it, and it starts to just get candied. And for me, more importantly, you lose all like the varietal spice. So whether it's, pyrazine in your Bordeaux varietals, or whether it's that sort of spicy herbal rotondone in your Syrah and things like that. So, but we don't. No, we're not worried about getting to cooked fruit. Nah.
Yeah, we can definitely get to cooked fruit here, and particularly, the way you started by saying that, your vineyards never shut down. Our Syrah vineyards never shut down, particularly late in the harvest, and you can get just totally obliterated fruit, and it can go over a weekend. We've seen 3 brick jumps, so we've seen it go from 13% alcohol to 15.5 in over a weekend. So
yeah, because when we're harvesting Syrah, it's still between 90 and 100 degrees in the Walla Walla Valley. So you'll see some big jumps. You'll see a brick in 2 days, easy.
So what's funny is, like, for us, our ripening cycle is really like, it's, again, as I said, it's short season, and the ripening cycle starts really fast. But as we get close to harvest, I mean, it is like at a snail's pace. So, we would kill for a 2-degree brick jump over a weekend, because oftentimes during harvest, we're battling rain conditions and praying that, we get that extra little bump, or we get those 5 days of, hell, sometimes 3 days of dry weather in between rain events, as I think they're called in California.
We don't know what that is.
So
although we have started making wine in the Willamette Valley, so yeah, now we really know what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just wow, this is what they mean by a bad vintage or a rainy vintage. So
or a 1 week window to pick.
Yeah, challenging vintage.
Yes.
Challenging.
That's right. There's only good and better vintages. So,
but I think the reality is like, it's just, I mean, that's what vintages are like here. We always deal with it. So, we don't, when we really get to fine tune our picking dates, you could say. For us, whether it's 21.1 or 21.2, and that's a week's difference.
Wow. That's actually like Cab Franc for us. So let's actually, if you have Cab Franc, let's taste Cab Franc.
So when did you start making Cab Franc?
So we've had Cab Franc since 2006, and every once in a while, and I will fully admit this, I feel that when our Cab Franc is good, this has really been a perplexing variety for us. We do this, and I expect this result, and we get something else, and then I'm expecting that the Cab Franc is going to be good, and it's amazing, and I'm like, I don't know. It's to me it's a really perplexing variety on its own. But we've done it for Wine Club 3 times, Brandon, 2 times?
13, 14, 15. I think those are the only 3 times we've done it.
Yeah, I mean 3 times. That sounds about right. And so I will tell you though that what we find is in the rocks. People talk about rocks and Syrah, but we really like Cab Franc in the rocks. And the reason being is because, when you're in the rocks, you're either going to make really ripe Syrah, or you're in a race against the heat to get your Syrah harvested before there's no acid in the wine and the pH or the mouthfeel is too high. But what we found with Cab Franc is it'll basically kind of stay in line with Syrah, and then at some point the weather will change, so the nights will go really cold, and then it'll stop. And so instead of the ground heating the variety, it'll actually cool it. And it's literally like the brakes have been hit. So you'll see a half a brick a week, and then all of a sudden, just like you were saying, it's like 0.2. Are we ever going to get the Cab Franc off before harvest is over? So, but this to me is this is Ancient Stones Vineyard, or Old Stones as it was called at the time. Now it's called Ancient Stones, but it's one of the cooler sites in the rocks, and I just think it makes really cool, kind of stinky Cabernet Franc.
Yeah, it retains that beautiful pyrazine green element that we all love in Cab Franc that really makes it kind of true to the varietal.
I haven't had this in a really long time. I drank 2014 Allier Chinon Viavine, so old vines, last night, and it was great. Do you do any Cab Franc, Christopher?
Yeah, that is our thing up here. Yeah. Cab Franc is definitively the grape of the Finger Lakes, and I think arguably for me, it's probably, it's probably my most sort of stable core product for sure, and it is what we should be making in the Finger Lakes, despite my push for Syrah and Grenache.
What about Riesling?
It's fine. No, Riesling is great here. Ultimately, again, like going back to the thing about climate, and talking about what works for you guys and what works for us and what works in other climates around the world, remembering that each grape has its own kind of unique tolerance level. So something like Riesling for us is great because it's extremely cold tolerant for a vinifera. Cab Franc is the same thing. And then both of them are also super botrytis resistant because of loose clusters and thick skins. So those two are probably, for me, they're the most flagship that is plantable across the entirety of the Finger Lakes, as long as you can see one of the three deep lakes, essentially. When we get outside of that, things like Pinot or Merlot or Syrah, Chardonnay can do phenomenal, but you just have to have them in the right site, because it's not possible if you don't. If you choose too cold of a site, they won't work. But Cab Franc and Riesling can grow almost everywhere and produce. For me, I mean, I think the quality of Cab Franc that the Finger Lakes can produce is up there with at least my favorite examples of Cab Franc in the world, and I would argue Riesling probably has a similar potential.
Yeah. So what's your metric for when to pick Cab Franc? And if you started a consulting business, you can send me a bill. But I'm not sure you've started that business too. But.
Of course I have,
okay,
by the way. So for me, Cabernet Franc is, I mean, again, you got to remember we're dealing with very different harvest stipulations. So we are looking for, now, mind you, I don't want my wine super ripe. I don't think it's appropriate for the region. I don't love the style in general. So I always look for a little bit sort of more tension in my styles, and I think a lot of folks do. But for me, I'm looking for still being able to taste some pyrazine in the wine. Like, honestly, there's this trend where everybody's trying to make Cab Franc without pyrazine, and plain and simple, like, if that's what you want, just make Merlot. Like, that's what Merlot is. It's Cab Franc without pyrazine. Just do that. I don't understand the trend. So I personally want some pyrazine in it, but I also, here in the Finger Lakes, what I'm looking for is skin texture more so than anything else. Is I'm looking for my grapes to lose the crunch, but still not be soft. I still want some sort of bite to the grape as I'm eating it.
Yeah.
And I want to be able to taste a little of the pyrazine actually still in the fruit itself. And that's sort of it. But for us, again, like the challenge is kind of getting there and then watching how many days of rain we have and how many days of dry we have between the rain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's, hey, shit, it's raining tomorrow and it's dry for one day and then it's raining again. Even though I want to pick now, I'm not going to pick because I see 4 dry days in a row next week and I can pick during those.
Yeah. Here's actually an interesting question as you were talking. So, someone asked, why does green work in Cab Franc but not so much in other varieties? Or let's just compare it to Cab. Like why? I mean, I like Cabernet with a little bit of green, but if my Cab had this much pyrazine, I would not be happy. So why does it work in Cab Franc? And as I'm asking you the question, I'm like, I never thought about that. I have no idea. But
you want me to jump? So
yeah,
if I can jump in on that for a second, I think ultimately it's just perception, right? And it's what we're taught and it's what we believe more so than anything else. Kind of ever since not having an answer to your what my desert island wine would be or my death row wine would be, I've thought back and at least near the top 3 would be Napa and or Cali Cab from the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And I mean, those wines had more pyrazine than this did for sure.
Yeah.
So I like the style personally. I mean, I like pyrazine. I like green herbal flavors, and I like it in Cabernet, both Franc and Sauv. Yeah, I think that there's a certain acceptance that Cab Franc can be a little leaner and greener. But the reality is, and I think honestly, everybody, at least on this call right now, likes it in their Syrah as well. And it's not necessarily pyrazine, but if you've got a bottle of Levay behind your shoulder, that is green and herbal. It's a different type of green and herbal, but like we like those styles. So ultimately, I think it's just a tolerance level with Cab Franc.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because I say a lot. I had this kind of like aha moment maybe 5 or 6 years after I started making wine. I said, "Wow, all of the wines that I think are the great wines of the world that I want to drink have a green edge to them, and I can go from Bandol to Burgundy to even South Africa or whatever. That like there's something about adding the herb, and if the herb is missing, I don't find it as compelling and as interesting. But
100%.
yeah, and as you're talking about the cabs from the 60s and 70s too, I was actually just thinking, and I never really thought about this before. I wonder if one of the things that people said, well, you have to give these wines 10 years, you have to give them 20 years, and everyone said it was tannin, but maybe it was tannin and pyrazine at the same time. But now we don't really get to experience wines that have as much tannin, so it's hard to go back and say, yeah, that's what it was, because no one makes wines like that anymore.
I mean, I think if you like, obviously, talking to some of the old timers in the MS crowd and some of those folk who actually remember tasting those wines in their earlier days, I think you'll hear that it was both. I mean, the immense amount of pyrazine from that like California sprawl, shade grown, overcropped stuff may not make the most approachable styles in the first 3 years, but over 30, 40, 50 years, those wines for me become some of the most magnificent wines in the world, like Old Ridge and Old Dunn and Old, Martha's Vineyard and BVs and all that stuff. Like those wines are phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately now, that it's hard to wait. And so a lot of people aren't waiting but no, I agree. I love that green edge to wine. So
Cab Franc is super delicious.
yeah, it's been I think I totally agree. I'm actually really surprised. I'm really and the reason I'm saying I'm surprised, not because I like it, it's greener than it was like a year ago, which is to me is awesome. I love that part about it.
So Brandon, there was no stem, right?
No stems. Harvested pretty early though. I mean, we like, just as Greg was saying, once the vineyard starts to cool, the bricks accumulation is slow. And so we were pulling this Cab Franc at about 22 bricks. So
Okay.
it's pretty low on the bricks level. This is always one of the craziest fermentations I've ever seen in the cellar. We do everything native, and this fermentation will kick off, and I'm not kidding you, it will push up the cap almost 5 feet. You have to fill a 1.5 ton bin, maximum 1 ton, or you'll have grapes on the floor. It's crazy. It just takes off, and then it will usually ferment in. I mean, I think the longest ferment I've had in this is 10 days. It just goes, and it usually it will basically, you can see signs of fermentation right after you crush it. It's crazy.
Huh. Is it and you're fermenting in
Literally stainless steel fermenters, the 1.5s.
Okay, cool. And then aging?
Pretty much neutral barriques. We threw I think 1 new barrel on the entire lot, but it was believe it was like a Boots barrel, Boots Grand Reserve, something a little more a little less invasive, to let the fruit show a little bit. We definitely did not want the oak to be noticeable on the wine. We just wanted it to add some volume to it.
Cool. So have you guys been changing your oak regimen over there? I mean, I know over the years, I know, Greg, you and I talked about concrete fermenters and about concrete, as vessels. Have you been changing your oak regime in the last 10 years?
I'll let Brandon take I'll comment. I'll let Brandon take the rest of the question. I think the only thing we've done is we've tried to go bigger as much as possible with Rhone varieties.
Yep.
And maybe with Bordeaux varieties, limit the amount. Kind of like a chef, sometimes you need to edit. So you can use 15 different barrel makers, but maybe 3 or 4 or 5 is really where you want to be. So you really kind of learn what that oak does. It's crazy because most people who are listening to us aren't a winemaker. I could taste Chris's Cab Franc and he put the exact same barrel that I put on, and the wine and the oak on the wine tastes totally different. One might taste sweet, the other might taste integrated. And you really have to learn your cellar, how it integrates with your actual wines. So Brandon, why don't you can finish the rest of that.
Yeah, for me, it's also been a process of finding the right cooperage for the right vineyard, and that takes time. It's a trial and error process. We've settled on, for example, Bacchus. It's one of our premier cab sites. It takes the lead on our reserve cab. A few years ago, I secured some Darnageau barrels. They're kind of bigger and smokier, and they really work well with that dark fruit that Bacchus shows. Whereas Finney, which is one of our larger Cabernet vineyards that we're using, really works well with a Sylvain barrel. Sylvain's a little less aromatic. It's more integrated into the wine, and it just works better with the more red fruited, lighter nature of what Finney is. And so, it's just one of these things. Over the years, you trial things on different vineyards, and I think that's more been our evolution in oak, is finding the right cooperage, the right toast level, the right forest for each vineyard site that we're using.
Yeah, it's again, we could sit here and talk about that for hours and hours and hours and hours. So Chris, let's end with this, since the death row meal is messing with both of our minds. Why don't we say what's the meal you're going to cook when we find the COVID vaccine and this is kind of behind us and we can all go out and celebrate again? What do you want to cook for people?
Oh, that's such a different question than the death row meal. You're throwing me off now. What do I want to cook for people? Well, honestly, hamburgers. Like, when it comes to wine, it's the perfect thing. And I want a perfect burger, and I want great Grenache every day. That's it.
Yeah, it's funny because Pam every single night has been like, we have hamburgers, we have hamburgers, we have hamburgers. It's she is totally 100% on the same line with you. Yeah, I guess comfort food and celebration. So yeah, well, that's about it. And Christopher, thank you so much for being on. So if people want to find your wines, how do we find your wines?
Well, you can hit up our website, www.elementwinery.com, or FLX Provisions, which is our wine shop where we sell our own wine plus a bunch of others. And just reach out, hit me up on Instagram at sommelierbates.com or at sommelierbates. I don't think there's a .com on Instagram, is there anymore?
Nope.
Cool. So yeah, those are the ways. And then depending on where you are, we may or may not have distribution. I can hook you up with that.
Yeah, and if anyone needs any help, just email us and we will help you with that. So Brandon, as always, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to chat online. And Christopher, hopefully I see you soon and in a teaching venue somewhere fun. So
I catch you.
thanks, gentlemen.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Pleasure, y'all.
Thanks.